I had the luck to grow up around Russians who taught me many of the things I know about having a really good or a really bad time, drinking, and singing gypsy songs about love and death. I loved Tom and Shura, friends of my parents and UN interpreters, and Shura's wife, Billy. I was thrilled to meet the odd people who swirled around in their living room. It was there that a sitar player gave me an introduction to Indian music. Mathematicians came by and talked about numbers theory. People fought about politics as if their lives depended on the outcome. I especially remember one imposing woman who had been a dancer in Russia. Her hair, dyed a special kind of dark purplish red like my Aunt Polly's, my mother said they used henna, stood on end around her face. From time to time, she pushed it back with her knobby hands, laden down with large rings set with murky stones. She gave me 2 bits of very important advice. Always hold your head up when you dance, she instructed. And to be beautiful, you must suffer. At age 6, I felt I knew something about the suffering part. In fact, I enjoyed pain. One winter day, I marched barefoot a quarter of a mile in the snow to see what it felt like to have really cold feet. It hurt. I liked jumping over fences and vaulting over fire hydrants, and I took pride in bearing the injuries that resulted with little more than a grimace. My mother seal freaked out whenever she caught me doing something that was probably going to result in injury. A soft and inactive urban Jewish person with a definite sense of what was proper for any human, especially female, to do or feel, she thought my appetite for pain unacceptable and also terribly weird. Luckily for me, she realized I needed an outlet even more than a scolding. Thus it was that when I was 8, after years of begging, I was allowed to take ballet lessons. Ballet training is painful. Your body has to move in ways that a body doesn't really go. You must rotate your legs and your hip joints and suck in your abdomen so that you have the posture you need to balance on a toe. Dancing with all of your body weight on that toe, which is resting on a tiny wooden block in the tip of a tight slipper, that was torture. Dressing for ballet class was a torture in itself, especially once I got expert advice from older dancers and equipped myself properly. The trick I learned was that you had to compress and bind all your parts the best way you could under leotards and tights. Dancers wore fishnet stockings, each one of which had ties at the top that were tied as tightly as possible around the waist. Under the leotard, but over the stockings, it was de rigueur to wear rubber baby pants. The rubber pants that went on over cloth diapers in those days. At 13, I took pride in squishing myself into little tiny pants designed for an infant, an 1/8 my size. The pants gave, as dancers said, a good line. Taking them off after class made for a cosmic mood improvement. Toe shoes hurt even when you weren't standing on one toe in them. So did regular slippers, which dancers customarily wore a whole size too small. Dancers buckled their belts or tied cords around their waists as tightly as possible, so as to make their midriffs look even smaller. Mine was as small as anyone's. All this lacing and buckling made it easy to suffer in whatever way street clothing might demand of me. I was tough. I could have been assigned almost any strange set of garments. I would have put them on and smiled radiantly, no matter how much it hurt. Sometimes this training came in handy. When I was a sophomore in high school, my friend Myrna took pity on me and arranged for me to have a blind date with Peter, one of her rejects. He invited me to a military ball at the New York Military Academy. a kind of reform school near West Point, where his brother was temporarily confined. Myrna pressured me into saying I'd go, and I went home and told my mother. I expected her to be elaborately scornful, or at least to say, well, we can't afford it, you don't have anything to wear. But instead, she became very excited. She sprang into action immediately, calling my cousin Jane, who lived in a posh Westchester suburb. It turned out that Jane and her friends went to balls all the time, and they had a collection of gowns that they all borrowed and exchanged. Some of these were sent to Queens. It boiled down to a choice between two dresses. Both were strapless with heart-shaped bodices and had acres of skirt poofing out from their tiny waists. I liked the red dress better, but my mother was worried about whether it would stay up. When I zipped the zipper, I could still breathe, so she knew it didn't fit. The other dress was aqua tulle with tulle ruching on the bodice. Aqua was very popular in the 50s, the color of the chlorinated water in a Hollywood swimming pool. Tulle was a diaphanous fabric that looked like chiffon but felt like metal screening. And the ruching was pleated strips of tulle that had been sewn in serpentine patterns all over the bodice and around its top. Miss America would have been pleased and proud to wear such a dress. Under a prom gown, you were required to wear a combination bra and corset called a Merry Widow. I don't remember where mine came from. Perhaps one of the ball goers from Westchester owned it. This widow started at the waist and went all the way up to the chest. It had a strapless brassiere built right in. You zipped it up the back once you had positioned it, and the cups of the bra grasped your breasts firmly and thrust them toward each other and then up. It was very tight around the rib cage, but your breasts sat in the cups the way fruit might sit in a bowl. I spent some time amusing myself with the Merry Widow, turning my upper body and watching in the mirror as the widow stayed perfectly still. My breasts followed the rest of me as I twisted first to one side and the other, leaving their widow cups empty and facing front. Then I turned back and my breasts plopped back into the cups. It was magical. Seal became even more enthusiastic as the big night neared. We bought a pair of beautiful and very expensive Italian sandals, which, as she said, I could wear again with other things. Like all such shoes, they were impractical and uncomfortable. They consisted of a network of thin turquoise straps like a spider web, and they started irritating my feet immediately. They'll stretch, I said, knowing they wouldn't. Seal averted her eyes and paid. She wanted me to be glamorous. As a final touch, she lent me her impossibly elegant opera-length white kid gloves, a treasure from a past life. I was equipped for the big night. Peter and his mother came to my house to pick me up. He looked as okay as anyone could who would have consented to date me in the first place. His mother wore a blazer and pearls, with permed hair and an upper-class accent. The only thing she and Seal had in common was their incessant smoking. The dress and the Merry Widow were already packed up in a garment bag. As Peter loomed over me in the doorway, his glasses blank and his acne standing out redly, I had a stab of panic. Surely we could return the shoes. But I remembered that, as expensive as they had been, they were on final sale and thus unreturnable. There was nothing for me to do but to get in the car. As with many high-stress occasions, I remember the evening only spottily. We drove for hours. West Point was far from Queens, and first we had to pick up Peter's brother's date in Connecticut. The mother smoked endless cigarettes and drove with one hand. We three young people sat as a stream of conversational pabulum dribbled out of her mouth and dried up, saying yes and no once in a while, just to demonstrate that we were still there. Finally, we arrived at the New York Military Academy, a ramshackle set of buildings on the Hudson River. I had imagined that a boarding school would be fancier. This place looked like an abandoned summer camp. The date and I got dressed and zipped up each other's merry widows in a very untidy room with a cloudy mirror, perhaps the brothers, and then we were ready. I can't remember where the mother was. Maybe the school provided a corral for them. As I went downstairs in my gown, my shoes hurt. More agonizing was my fear that I'd fall down the stairs. The widow pinched and bit, but at the same time, my breasts felt insecure, as if any minute they might bounce off their little shelf. The dress flapped like an old screen door. Every time my wrists brushed against the skirt, it tingled in a most unpleasant way. The evening passed in merriment, an innocent riot, a foxtrot and a couple of cokes, to be exact. Peter couldn't dance and only wanted to step outside for a look at the moon. That was absolutely the last thing I wanted. I already knew I hated him with all my heart. I would even have been glad to see his mother. My body throbbed, and not with lust. The garter belt that held up my stockings bit into my waist. The stockings clung clammily to my legs and caught on every frill of tulle. The merry widow made my ribs ache. The sandal straps dug into each toe. The insides of my arms hurt. I had to spend the last part of the evening resting my hands on my hips. When I allowed them to drop to my sides, I was in agony. Even excruciating evenings end somehow. After the polite thank yous and the friendly, enthusiastic waves and goodbyes, I finally made it into my bedroom, where I tore myself out of my clothes. The gown stood up by itself in the corner. The merry widow flung down before it like a partial human sacrifice. As my diaphragm expanded fully for the first time since I had crammed myself into the ball dress 8 hours earlier, I saw that the beautiful aqua tulle ruching had bitten into my flesh, abrading it under the arms and down their insides. I was bleeding from the armpit to the elbow. Somehow, I had managed not to bleed on the gown.
Jill, your mention of the New York Military Academy, our favorite presidential candidate went there.
That's right.
Donald Trump.
Oh my.
The only school he
Maybe
could get
he was
into.
there at that.
Maybe he was there at that dance.
Now you can feel even worse.
More pain.
You can send him your book, Jill.
Just send him the chapter.
Oh, it's terrific. Oh,
That's funny.
gosh. It's very reminiscent of the 50s, I have to say.
Yes, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to read too long, so I didn't read the part about the receiving line. There was a receiving line that you had to go through, and there I was with my mother's opera gloves, which my mother was quite a bit smaller than I was, and so I had crammed myself into these gloves. And of course, you're supposed to take the glove off. You're not supposed to shake the hand of General D. Ripper and Mrs. General D. Ripper with the glove on. And I couldn't get it off. The experiences that one has.
Did you keep a diary?
No. Oh, well, I mean, I kept journals at different points in my life, all of which I have burned, but this doesn't come out of them.
It's amazing you remember the detail.
Well, I think what I remember the clothes, and that, for me, started
Brings
a
it-
train
yeah.
of reminiscences. Yeah.
How could you forget that?
Yeah,
Well, the
I'm
experience you couldn't
identifying
forget.
with what you're saying, with so much of it, the things that I wore that hurt like hell.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are other things in this chapter that hurt like hell too. You're not the only one.
I can't imagine experiencing all of those painful things at once. I've just experienced one at a time and been miserable.
No, I would say that in some ways that was the most appallingly painful evening I've ever spent in my entire life.
Have you kept up with your date that night? You don't know what happened to him?
I never talked to him again. Although, of course, it wasn't his fault, the poor guy.
What do they hurt?
Did you wear the shoes again?
I tried to. They were, my mother believed that your shoes should be very expensive. That was her, her fashion philosophy was wear a black dress and a pair of really good shoes. And so these were very expensive Italian sandals. And they were beautiful, but they were not made for my feet.
Actually, wearing sandals at that time was not necessarily done that much.
That's right.
So those were rather long.
Yeah, well, of course it was a long dress, who the hell could see them?
What a waste, you could have had sneakers.
Well, no one had sneakers then.
Well, that's true. Or bare feet, better.
So what's the rest of your book cover? How much time?
It goes from my earliest memories, which are when I was about 3, to nowish. But of course, the most poignant experiences one has as a teenage person, I think. Where you're awkward, you feel that you're wrong in your clothes, or you are wrong in your clothes. Yeah, but no, I tried to go all the way up.
I'd just like to ask if there are experiences that people have had that this reminds them.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Being a teenager is hard, period.
It's a test.
Being a woman.
Well, yeah, the silly clothes, right.
Either way, probably.
Yeah.
Well, let's ask the guys.
Right.
Do you have clothes experiences where you were wrong in your clothes, or Gordon is kind of laughing.
I'm laughing
long
that
skirt
in
and high boots, that's it.
our family photo album which my mother kept, there's a great picture of me going to an 8th grade CCS dance, and we thought we knew what was the right style.
Yeah.
And I had this silk scarf on and this red shirt and these bell-bottom pants, which my mother said, "You don't want those." "Oh, I gotta have those, I gotta have those." And it looked really ridiculous, and there's a picture of it somewhere up in the attic. That's where she was, but I thought it was all great, and she didn't know what she was talking about. She did. I didn't.
But you were right for your age.
I was right for my age. Yeah.
When
but
you
it's
got
all
to
fun.
the dance,
It was,
did people think that you?
no, it was all.
They were cool.
Everybody was
Everybody else had
looking
them.
goofy. It was all pretty good.
Yeah.
Anyway, it was all.
But it fit, it wasn't uncomfortable.
It was not. There was no pain.
Yeah.
No pain, right.
Yeah. Well, if people want, I could finish this chapter if you wanted, or you could go on to
Yes,
your.
please.
Okay.
We're all hungry.
Well, I have one thing to say as her daughter. She always told me never buy a strapless dress. And I listened to her until one day I did buy a strapless dress, and I wore it to a wedding, and I said, "This is why." I experienced the reason that you never buy a strapless dress.
Okay, so I'll just finish this chapter, which doesn't have that much more, but I didn't wanna, if people had other things to go on to, I didn't wanna keep them. Okay, so I managed not to bleed on the gown. I never again had such an experience, such a totally uncomfortable and all-encompassing experience while I was in high school, but I definitely had other encounters with clothes that hurt sufficiently to whet my just barely slumbering appetite for discomfort. For another formal occasion, I blithely clipped a pair of crystal earrings, all the rage that year, to my earlobes. They bit in so hard that the lobes turned white, then purple, then white again. The clips could have bitten through metal. The world of undergarments, especially in the era just before bra burning, presented me and any woman with an array of devices for pinching and constricting. These tested me, but not to the core. I had to wait a few years for another total experience. In the mid-60s, I got involved with a metal mesh dress. The designer I was working for, Ruth Graves, had been fascinated with the stuff then used to make evening bags and eyeglass cases. Only one company in the world manufactured it, and she convinced them to give her a piece. In exchange, she would make a dress they could use for their own promotions. Metal mesh is the slinkiest stuff in the world, dense and smooth. It pours itself over your skin like heavy water. It radiates coolness. It resembles snakeskin in its scaly quality. But it's not exactly a dress fabric. Ruth found it a challenge. It was hard to cut and even harder to join the cut pieces together to make a garment. Her husband was an engineer with a grasp of tools. He cut the pattern out with metal snips and fastened the pieces together with jewelry loops and pliers. Ruth's design was simple, a short A-shaped dress with 2 straps. She gave it a thick silk lining to keep every wire from pinching. You just slipped it over your head, and there you were, clad in slinky gold-colored mesh, which enhanced any woman's skin and hair and made her instantly glamorous. Ruth wore the dress once. She was very quiet about her experience. She made no remarks about her evening, nothing about who had found it gorgeous or who had asked her to make one for them. These facts would have been in the usual booth report about a night on the town in a new outfit. This silence in itself should have tipped me off when I asked to borrow it. I was desperate to make an appearance in it, though. It was beautiful, different, unique, so I was slow to pick up Ruth's cues. I knew the awful truth the moment I slipped the dress down over my head. For one thing, each of the little metal loops that joined the pieces had a way of pinching when I moved suddenly. For another, my long hair immediately got painfully caught between the scales. My heart failed me for an instant, but it was a very beautiful dress. I figured I had enough experience and practice in pain management to take it on. I wore it to a cocktail party, a studio opening some friends of mine had. Penniless sculptors, they had gone into business making plexiglass furniture and were suddenly making money hand over fist. They were about to become rich and famous and leave their wild pasts behind, but they didn't know it yet. All they knew was that they needed to celebrate in the way of their kind. Therefore, they threw a wild and extravagant bash with enough food and drink to feed all the starving artists of New York. They invited some now famous rock bands, photographers from the Village Voice, and a lot of people in very strange clothes and hairdos. I felt myself to be one of the belles of the evening in my incredible golden outfit. That was the night LSD somehow found its way into the punch. Luckily, I never drank anything but scotch in those days, so I knew that what was happening to me was not the same as what was happening to all the suddenly goofy, punch-drinking guests. What was happening to me was that I was aching all over. I didn't understand why. Perhaps I was getting the flu. Perhaps it was the air in the studio. Perhaps the behavior of many of the guests getting high on acid without knowing it was making me tense. Later that night, that moment of truth for fashion victims, when I took off the gorgeous golden dress, the dress that shimmered and gave me a fairy tale glow, I understood. It wasn't the flu. What had happened to me was something very simple. My shoulders were a mass of bruises. The dress was so heavy, it had bruised me just lying across my shoulders. My body had been aching all night because it had to exert itself in unfamiliar ways simply to hold up a dress. The next morning, I got on the scale with it. That little dress weighed 15 pounds.
Where's that dress now?
Right.
I don't have it, it was never
It was
mine.
never, it was just on loan.
Yeah. And believe me, I wouldn't have had it.
No.
Did you talk with the designer?
Oh,
Did you-
yeah.
Did you have a discussion about the
Sure.
reality?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it was a prototype and she never made another one.
You were the one.
Well, she wore it first, it's just that she didn't tell me.
Yeah, of course that was.
Did you tell
Hoped
her?
it would work for you.
Oh, yeah, I mean, then we both said, oh,
Compare
yeah,
notes.
really.
It seems to me a wonderful vehicle to talk about yourself, to find clothes. What prompted you to do that?
What prompted me to do it was that I had lived in the East Village in the 60s, and I had a lot of stories that I told about people that I knew, and, because the East 60s was a very important cultural nexus. And I knew all kinds of famous people, and I had stories about quite a few of them. And people said to me, you should write your memoir, you should write your own. And I sat down to write some stories up, and I realized that I would not want my children to hear these stories. It would be embarrassing, and then I started thinking, well, all the people that I'm telling the stories about are not dead yet. Maybe I don't want to go there. And then I realized that if I thought about what I was wearing, I could write about my life in a different way. So that was how it came about.
There is one book, do you know Love, Loss, and Why
Yes, I do,
War?
yeah.
Very different though,
Yes, it's very
because
different.
it's really more about what she remembered wearing when certain things happened. It wasn't about the clothing itself.
Right, and also, it was a lot more cryptic. I mean, she was an illustrator basically, and the drawings are very appealing, but yeah.
But there are remarkably few other books. There's books about high fashion, there's books about the history of costume, there are books for people who want to make clothes at home, but there are very little that's about the experience of
That's right.
ordinary people dealing with the questions, the identity questions, the social questions, the aesthetic questions of just what are you going to wear, how is it going to affect you, how is it going to affect other people. It's very little.
No, it's a great
Back
idea.
when I was in grade school, early grade school, first, second grade, boys wore knickers in those days,
Right.
and they were made out of wool,
Yes.
and they were
They
awful.
itched.
They
Yeah.
itched. They're terrible, and I remember, thank God, when I could stop wearing knickers. I think that's long forgotten, knickers.
Yeah.
And girdles.
Oh, yeah, there's something in here about
I
it.
went to a couple of football games with girdles.
Oh, dear.
Wow.
Also, woolen leggings for going out in the snow, which itched.
Yeah,
Right.
When-
that's a lot like knickers.
Yeah, a lot like knickers, yeah.
Well, this is all being recorded, So
Thank
talk
you.
about your knickers somewhere else now.
Different kind of posted somewhere.
Fodder for the website.
Yeah, why not?
Well, when I was a teenager, I remember I was always in love with someone.
Uh-huh.
It didn't matter who.
Well, it was a variety.
Mattered terribly.
And it wasn't always returned either.
I think it's great as, it's sort of, you know, when I read it, I was thinking of if I was still teaching, like a gender, race, and class course, it's very interesting, sort of giving an overview of a woman's perspective with this historical lens through the clothing, which is really, you know, it's quite brilliant, and I think would be very interesting in terms of sort of engaging undergraduates and kind of making people think about this period in time and how women were sort of understood in the world and how they had to express themselves in the world, and sort of, so I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, and how we were corseted.
Yeah.
So you're
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah, what
It's
that says about
fascinating.
people's view and expectations of women.
And of themselves.
You mean the willingness to bind your feet?
Yeah.
The binding.
And other parts of yourself, not just your feet.
Yeah.
And there was a very funny cartoon in the National Lampoon, not a cartoon, a photo that they had done, where they had a woman in a girdle that went from her neck to her ankles, and then she had these enormous feet. Because of course it all has to go somewhere, you know?
Like a balloon.
No, it's fascinating. We were talking about our generation was not, you know, and it's just a few decades, but it's a completely different level of comfort. We weren't doing the stiff fabrics. It wasn't the style.
Yeah,
it
ours
wasn't.
was like oversized.
Yeah, it was a
Everything was
different
oversized.
thing.
A big sweater, big hair, big sweater, big, you know, everything.
Big.
It's true. It's true. Big stuff.
Big
The
heels.
big shoulders, the big shoulder pads.
Yeah, those pads.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
It was great to read to you. You're a great audience.
Fun.
Yes, and buy the book.
You know,
Why
I
not?
saw her the other day.
Bianca's been
I
wonderful.
get to talk to her.
The service here.
Yeah.
Well, that's about it for now.